More than 1/3 of all global shipping passes through the South China Sea every year, over $3 trillion worth of goods moving between the Pacific and Indian Oceans. China claims nearly all of it, based on a map drawn in 1947. An international court ruled that the claim China made was illegal in 2016. China ignored the ruling and kept building and expanding. Right now, a rusting World War II warship with a handful of Filipino Marines living on it is sitting in the middle of disputed waters, and under a treaty signed in 1951, a Chinese attack on that vessel could draw the United States into a war. This isn't made up. This is the current situation in South China Sea today. Everything we have researched and included in this video has been fact-checked. This video is how we got here, and why it matters for everyone watching this right now. The South China Sea is bordered by China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei and Taiwan. All of them have claims to different parts of this sea, and most of these claims overlap. And sitting over almost all of it, roughly 90% of the entire sea, is China's 9-dash line, a U-shaped boundary that runs thousands of kilometers from the Chinese mainland, cutting deep into the exclusive economic zones of every country that borders the water. The line first appeared on a Chinese map in 1947 when the nationalist government drew it to assert Chinese sovereignty over the islands the Japanese had occupied during World War II. It was a claim to the islands and their surrounding waters, not to everything inside the line. When the Communists won the Civil War in 1949 and the nationalists fled to Taiwan, the new People's Republic inherited the map. Over the following decades, Beijing expanded the claim significantly, asserting what it calls historic rights over all the waters and resources within the line, a much bigger assertion than what the 1947 map was ever intended to represent. In 2013, the Philippines had finally had enough and took China to an international tribunal under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. In 2016, the tribunal ruled clearly. The 9-dash line had no legal basis. China's historic rights claims were invalid under international law. Its interference with Philippine fishing and its island-building activities were unlawful. It was as clear a legal verdict as it was possible to get. Unsurprisingly, China announced it didn't recognize the tribunal's authority, refused to participate, and just kept building. In August 2023, it published a new map, a 10-dash line, extending its claim even further, now including Taiwan within the boundary. Several countries immediately rejected it, but China published it anyway. The reason none of this has been resolved is that China is not making a legal argument. It is making a power argument. The claim exists not because it is defensible in court. It was tried in court and lost, but because China has the military and economic weight to enforce it on the water, regardless of what any tribunal says. And every year that passes, it builds a little more infrastructure, stations a few more ships, and moves the practical reality a little further in its favour. In 1995, China quietly occupied Mischief Reef in the Spratly Islands, a feature well inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The Philippines protested. China ignored the protest and decided to stay. 4 years later, the Philippine government responded in the only way it felt it practically could. It took a World War II-era landing ship called the BRP Sierra Madre and deliberately ran it aground on 2nd Thomas Shoal, about 200 kilometers from the Philippine island of Palawan, and well within Philippine waters under international law. The plan from the Philippines was simple: park a commissioned naval vessel there, station Marines on board, and create a permanent Philippine presence that China couldn't simply sail past. That vessel has been rusting on that reef ever since. A rotating detachment of Filipino Marines lives on it. The hull has large holes. Water gets in. The ship cannot move. It is by any ordinary measure one of the most decrepit military outposts on Earth. It is also arguably one of the most consequential. China's position is that the BRP Sierra Madre needs to go. The Philippines' position is that it stays. And those two positions have produced one of the most sustained and dangerous confrontations in the region in decades. Chinese Coast Guard vessels began seriously harassing Philippine resupply missions to the ship in 2023. In February of that year, a Chinese vessel hit the Philippine Coast Guard ship BRP Malapascua with a military-grade laser, temporarily blinding members of the crew. Water cannons followed, then ramming the vessel. Then, on June 17, 2024, the most serious incident yet. Chinese Coast Guard vessels backed by maritime militia and PLA Navy ships surrounded, rammed and boarded Philippine Navy inflatable boats. Chinese personnel used knives and axes to destroy equipment and puncture hulls. They seized 7 Philippine firearms. The Filipino personnel on board, ordered not to carry their weapons in an operational position, fought back with their bare hands against armed Chinese Coast Guardsmen. One Philippine Navy SEAL, Jeffrey Facundo, lost his thumb when a Chinese vessel rammed his boat at high speed. The armed forces of the Philippines chief called it piracy. China, on the other hand, called it a lawful inspection. We'll let you make up your own mind on that one. A provisional agreement was reached in July 2024, allowing resupply missions to continue, and 13 missions were completed without major incident through early 2026. But the tensions didn't stop, they just moved to other reefs. In April 2026, the Philippines accused China of using cyanide around Second Thomas Shoal in at least 4 documented incidents, alleging it was designed to kill the fish population that the Marines depend on for food and to weaken the reef supporting the ship. China denied it and accused the Philippines of staging the evidence. What makes all of this more than a bilateral dispute is a treaty signed 73 years ago. The 1951 US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty commits both countries to act if either faces an armed attack in the Pacific, and the US has repeatedly and explicitly confirmed that this commitment covers Philippine armed forces, vessels and aircraft anywhere in the South China Sea. The BRP Sierra Madre is a commissioned Philippine naval vessel. An attack on it or its crew would trigger that treaty. Not automatically. The US would need to act through its constitutional processes, but the legal and political pressure to respond would be enormous. A handful of Marines living on a rusting hulk in disputed waters is the closest thing the region has to a tripwire. While the focus has been on the Philippines' flashpoint, China has spent the past decade doing something more strategically significant than winning individual confrontations. It has been physically building new territory. Between 2013 and 2015, Chinese dredgers created more than 3,200 acres of new land across reefs and shoals in the Spratly Islands, piling sand onto submerged features until they became islands large enough to build on. Then they got to work and built runways capable of landing military aircraft, radar installations, hangars, port facilities, missile systems. By 2022, the US Indo-Pacific Commander confirmed that 3 of those artificial islands, Mischief Reef, Subi Reef, and Fiery Cross, were fully militarized. All of this despite a specific pledge Xi Jinping made to Barack Obama at the White House in September 2015, that China had no intention of militarizing the islands. The transformation is far from subtle. Subi Reef now has a 3-kilometer runway, radar domes, surface-to-air missile batteries, and a deep-water port. 2 close-by islands named Fiery Cross and Mischief Reef are similar, and let's be clear, these are not weather stations or fishing shelters. They are forward military bases positioned across some of the most important shipping lanes in the world and they give China a permanent military presence in waters it could not previously reach without deploying from the mainland. As recently as January 2026, satellite imagery showed China beginning new dredging work at Antelope Reef in the Paracels, turning what had been described as little more than a sandbar into what looks likely to become another military outpost. Vietnam has been watching and doing its own quiet version of the same thing. Since 2021, Vietnam has reclaimed roughly 2/3 as much land in the Spratlys as China did in its major building phase. Vietnam's position in the South China Sea is not neutral. It has its own claims and its own presence. And the fact that it is now following China's playbook suggests that whoever eventually negotiates any settlement will be dealing not just with China and the Philippines, but with a sea that has been quietly militarized by multiple countries simultaneously. Every incident at Second Thomas Shoal, every water cannon blast, every confrontation at Scarborough Shoal happens in the shadow of one question that nobody wants to answer directly. At what point does this become a war, and who gets pulled in? The US-Philippines Treaty is the most obvious escalation mechanism, but it is not the only one. In April 2026, the Balakaitan exercises, the annual joint military drills between the Philippines and its allies, took place on a scale nobody had seen before. More than 17,000 troops from 7 nations participated. Japan deployed approximately 1,400 combat troops to Philippine soil for the first time since the Second World War. Japanese forces fired the Type 88 surface-to-ship missile in a live-fire exercise, the first time Japan had used that weapon system outside its own territory. France deployed an amphibious helicopter carrier. The drills included live-fire exercises in northern Luzon, directly facing the Taiwan Strait, and in Palawan, overlooking the South China Sea. China called it playing with fire. The exercise director called it a routine military operation. Both statements were technically accurate. The Taiwan dimension makes all of this hard to contain. A conflict over Taiwan would almost certainly involve the South China Sea simultaneously. The artificial islands China has built are military assets in a theatre that includes both disputes. The US bases in the Philippines are relevant to both, and the shipping lanes that Japan and South Korea depend on run through both. The two flashpoints cannot be cleanly separated. A miscalculation in one could immediately become a crisis in both. The pattern underlying all of it is the one that should worry people most. Since China first seized Mischief Reef in 1995, every administration in the Philippines has faced the same sequence: a confrontation, a diplomatic protest, a negotiated pause, and then a resumption of pressure with China in a slightly stronger position than before. The pauses have never produced genuine de-escalation. They have produced consolidation. The artificial islands exist because of what happened in the spaces between the crises. What China is building on the ground, or rather on the sand, is a fait accompli. By the time a conflict actually starts, the position it would be starting from would be very different from the one that existed in 1995. The ASEAN Code of Conduct negotiations, the diplomatic process designed to set rules for behaviour in the South China Sea, have been dragging for decades. The Philippines, as ASEAN chair in 2026, is pushing for a text by July. China has consistently insisted that any code must exclude cooperation with non-regional military powers, which would effectively prohibit the kind of US and Japanese involvement that the Philippines considers essential to its security. That gap has not closed. The July deadline is, by most assessments, more rhetorical than realistic. What the South China Sea has is not a solution in sight. It has a set of structural conditions: a rejected legal ruling, militarized artificial islands, an active confrontation at a rusting warship, a treaty commitment that could draw a superpower in, and a coalition of allies that is growing and deepening every year, that make the space between a manageable dispute and an unmanageable conflict narrower than it has ever been. The question is not whether an incident serious enough to test those conditions will happen. The pattern says it will. The question is whether anyone has worked out what to do when it does.